In the summer of 2008, a man from a New York investment firm drove into Scotia, California, and bought the entire town. Every house, the hotel, the cookhouse, the museum, the fire station, the power plant, the baseball field, the streets themselves, all of it. The transaction was part of a bankruptcy settlement, and the man represented a company called Marathon Structured Finance, and the purchase price was recorded in Humboldt County court filings with a clinical precision that matched the coldness of the moment. A community where 1,200 people had lived and worked and raised their children under the canopy of the tallest trees on earth had been reduced to a line item on a balance sheet. The workers who still remained in Scotia packed their tools and their lunch pails for the last time and walked out of a mill that had been cutting redwood timber since before Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. They had been employed by the Pacific Lumber Company for 145 years. That company no longer existed. The name had been dissolved in a bankruptcy proceeding, and the town that Pacific Lumber had built from nothing, that it had owned in its entirety for a century and a half, was now the property of a financial holding company based 3,000 miles away. Scotia sits in the Eel River Valley in Humboldt County, on the far northern coast of California. To reach it from San Francisco requires a 5-hour drive north on Highway 101, past the Marin Headlands, past the vineyards of Sonoma, through the river towns of Mendocino County, and into the dense green country where the Coast Range meets the Pacific. The Redwood Belt begins around Garberville and extends north in a continuous band along the coastal fog zone. The trees grow here because of the fog. Marine air rolling in from the Pacific Ocean deposits moisture on the needle canopy through the summer months, when there is no rain, and the water drips down through the branches and soaks into the deep, dark soil of the forest floor. A mature coast redwood, Sequoia sempervirens, can reach 350 feet in height and 22 feet in diameter at the base. Some of the trees standing in the forests around Scotia germinated before the fall of Rome. The Eel River runs through the valley in broad meanders, carrying silt and gravel down from the mountains to the east. It is a wild river, prone to catastrophic flooding during winter storms, when atmospheric rivers from the Pacific dump inches of rain on the steep, unstable slopes of the Coast Range. The 1964 flood, the worst in recorded history for the region, sent the Eel 20 feet above flood stage and destroyed bridges, roads, and entire neighborhoods in the downstream towns. The valley floor where Scotia sits is relatively protected, set back from the main channel on a broad alluvial terrace. But the river's presence is constant. You can hear it from anywhere in town during the wet season, a low, continuous roar underneath everything. The Pacific Lumber Company was founded in 1863 by a group of San Francisco investors who had come north to harvest the coastal redwoods. The trees were, by the standards of the 19th century timber industry, almost unbelievably valuable. Redwood lumber is straight-grained, rot-resistant, insect-resistant, fire-resistant, and light for its strength. It was the perfect building material for a state that was growing with explosive speed. San Francisco, rebuilt after the fires and earthquakes of the 1850s and 1860s, consumed redwood at a rate that transformed the forests of the North Coast within a generation. The early logging operations were brutal and efficient. Crews of men with axes and crosscut saws felled the trees by hand, then skidded the logs down to the river on corduroy roads built of smaller logs laid side by side, and floated them downstream to mills at the river mouth. Pacific Lumber's first mill was a modest operation, but the company's founders understood something that many of their competitors did not. The redwood forests of Humboldt County were not infinite, and the companies that logged recklessly would run out of timber within a few decades. Pacific Lumber adopted a policy of sustained yield, cutting trees at a rate that allowed the forest to regenerate. This was not environmentalism in the modern sense, it was business strategy. A company that managed its timber as a renewable resource could continue operating indefinitely, while a company that clear-cut everything and moved on would simply cease to exist when the trees were gone. This distinction would become the central tragedy of Scotia's story. because it was precisely this patient, long-term management of the forest that made Pacific lumber so valuable to the man who would eventually destroy it. The company built Scotia in stages over the last decades of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th. It started with a mill and a few bunkhouses for the workers. Then it built proper houses, small frame structures arranged in rows on the terrace above the river. Then a general store, a hotel, a cookhouse where workers could eat communal meals, a school for the workers' children, a church, a baseball diamond, a swimming pool, a small hospital. The company built the water system that piped water from springs in the hills above town. It built the power plant that generated electricity. It built the streets and maintained them. It built a community hall where dances and meetings and holiday celebrations were held. It planted the lawns and the gardens and the elm trees that lined the main street. Every structure, every pipe, every wire, every square foot of ground in Scotia was owned by the Pacific Lumber Company. The workers did not own their homes. They rented them from the company at rates that were, by the standards of the time and place, extremely low. Electricity was free, water was free. The rent on a 3-bedroom house in the 1970s was approximately $75 a month. This arrangement, which would strike a modern observer as either paternalistic or idyllic, depending on their political orientation, was the defining feature of life in Scotia for more than a century. The company provided everything. In return, the workers provided their labor. The relationship was straightforward, personal, and almost feudal in its simplicity. A worker at Pacific Lumber knew his foreman by first name. The foreman knew the worker's wife and children. The mill superintendent knew every family in town. Disputes were resolved informally, over lunch at the cookhouse or at the general store on Saturday morning. There was no city government because there was no city in the legal sense. Scotia was an unincorporated community, a census-designated place with no elected officials, no municipal budget, no zoning board. The Pacific Lumber Company was the government. Its decisions were the law. Its property was the town. The social life of Scotia was organized around the company with the same completeness as its physical infrastructure. The cookhouse served 3 meals a day, and the long tables where workers ate together were the town's public square, the place where news was exchanged, complaints were aired, and the rhythms of daily life were synchronized. Families gathered at the community hall for dances on Saturday nights. The company sponsored a baseball team that played other company and town teams across the county. Christmas was celebrated with a company-organized party for the workers' children, with gifts purchased from the company budget and distributed by the mill superintendent in a Santa Claus costume. The 4th of July featured a picnic on the baseball diamond, with hamburgers and corn on the cob and a fireworks display paid for by the company. These were not gestures of corporate benevolence in the modern sense. They were the organic functions of a community that had no other institution to organize them. In Scotia, everything that was public was also private. The company was the town, and the town was the company, and neither could be distinguished from the other. The wages at Pacific Lumber were competitive with other timber operations in the region and came with the additional benefit of extremely low living costs. A mill worker in the 1970s and 1980s could earn $12 to $18 an hour, which, combined with the negligible rent and free utilities, meant that families in Scotia had a standard of living that exceeded what the raw wage numbers would suggest. Workers could save money. They could send their children to college. They could retire with some security. The pension plan was modest but reliable. The health insurance covered the basics. It was not a luxurious life, but it was a stable one, and the stability was underwritten by the forest. As long as the trees kept growing and the mill kept cutting, the life would continue. By the mid-20th century, Pacific Lumber employed approximately 900 people on a regular basis, with the workforce rising to 1,600 during peak logging seasons. The population of Scotia stabilized at roughly 1,200 residents. Nearly every working adult in town was employed at the mill or in the logging operations in the surrounding forest. The men who did not work for the company directly, the barber, the gas station attendant, the school janitor were supported by the wages that the company paid. There was no economic activity in Scotia that did not trace back, through one link or another, to the cutting and milling of redwood trees. The mill itself was an impressive operation. Massive old-growth redwood logs, some of them 6 and 8 feet in diameter, were trucked in from the surrounding forests on heavy-duty logging trucks and rolled into the mill pond, a large pool of water where the logs were stored and sorted before being pulled up onto the carriage and fed through the headsaw. The headsaw was a bandsaw, a continuous loop of toothed steel that ran between two wheels and could slice through a log as cleanly as a knife through cheese. The sound it made, a high-pitched metallic scream that rose and fell as the blade bit into the wood, was the dominant sound in Scotia for most of the 20th century. You could hear it from every house in town. The mill ran in shifts, and the whine of the headsaw was the town's clock. When it started in the morning, the town woke up. When it stopped at night, the town went quiet. The logging operations in the forests above Scotia were equally impressive and equally loud. In the early decades, the company used railroad logging, narrow-gauge trains that hauled logs out of the forest on temporary tracks laid along the ridgelines and down the slopes. The railroad was replaced by logging trucks in the mid-20th century, heavy-duty vehicles with dual axles and massive bunks that could carry logs weighing tens of thousands of pounds down winding mountain roads to the mill. The loggers themselves were a breed apart. They worked in some of the most dangerous conditions in American industry, on steep slopes in wet weather, around trees that could fall unpredictably, with chainsaws and choker cables and heavy equipment that killed or maimed a man every season. The fatality rate in the Pacific Northwest logging industry was and remains among the highest of any occupation in the United States. The men who did this work were tough, skilled, and fiercely proud of their profession. They did not sentimentalize the trees. A tree was a crop, and when it was mature, you harvested it. But the older loggers, the men who had learned the trade from their fathers, understood the forest in a way that transcended the purely commercial. They knew which groves to leave alone. They knew how fast a hillside could erode if you cut too much too quickly. They knew the forest as a living system, not just as standing inventory. The lumber that came out of the Scotia mill was among the finest in the world. Clear-heart redwood, knot-free and straight-grained, was graded and stacked and loaded onto flatbed trucks and railroad cars for shipment to markets across the country. Redwood decking, redwood siding, redwood fence boards, redwood shingles. The wood went to builders in Los Angeles and San Francisco and Portland and Seattle. It went to millwork shops that turned it into window frames, door jambs, and molding. The demand was steady, and the supply, managed under the company's sustained yield policy, was reliable. Pacific Lumber was not making anyone fabulously wealthy. It was not a glamorous company. It did not have a flashy brand or a national advertising campaign. It was a quiet, well-managed timber company in a remote part of California that had been doing the same thing, in roughly the same way, for over a century. Its stock traded on the New York Stock Exchange, but it was the kind of stock that widows and retirees held for the dividend, not the kind that day traders bought for capital gains. The annual reports were plain. The board meetings were quiet. The company's unofficial motto, repeated by longtime employees with a kind of proprietary pride, was "the best company in the worst location." Newsweek magazine, in an article published in the early 1980s, called Scotia the last company town. The phrase was not entirely accurate. There were other unincorporated communities in the United States where a single company still owned most of the structures and most of the land. But Scotia was the most complete and the best preserved. It was a living artifact of a form of economic and social organization that had been common in the 19th century and had almost entirely disappeared by the late 20th. In coal mining regions of Appalachia, in textile towns across the Piedmont, in steel towns along the Monongahela, the company towns had been broken up decades earlier, the houses sold to their occupants, the company stores closed, the paternalistic relationships dissolved into the ordinary transactions of the free market. Scotia had never made that transition. The company still owned everything. The workers still rented their homes from the company. The power plant still belonged to the company. The streets were still the company's streets. It was as if a small piece of the 1890s had been preserved under glass in a redwood forest on the far northern coast of California. The glass shattered in 1985. Charles Hurwitz was a financier based in Houston, Texas, the chairman of a holding company called Maxim Inc. Hurwitz was a corporate raider of a type that proliferated in the 1980s, when deregulation and the rise of junk bond financing made it possible for relatively small investors to acquire much larger companies through debt-financed takeovers. The strategy was straightforward. Identify an undervalued company, borrow heavily to finance a hostile takeover, then extract value from the acquired company's assets to pay down the debt. The targets were often companies that held valuable assets, real estate, timber, mineral rights, but that were managed conservatively and therefore traded at prices below the liquidation value of those assets. Pacific Lumber was a textbook example. Its stock was undervalued because the company's sustained yield timber policy left billions of board feet of standing old-growth redwood unharvested. From the perspective of a Wall Street analyst, those trees were not a managed resource. They were unrealized inventory. Hurwitz assembled $850 million in junk bond financing, much of it arranged through the investment bank Drexel Burnham Lambert and its legendary junk bond trader Michael Milken. Drexel Burnham would later plead guilty to federal securities fraud charges, and Milken would serve 22 months in federal prison. But in 1985, the junk bond market was in full bloom, and the money was available. Hurwitz's Maxim Inc. launched a hostile takeover bid for Pacific Lumber. The company's board of directors, led by descendants of the founding families who had managed the company for generations, resisted. They had run Pacific Lumber as a stewardship, not as a financial instrument, and they understood what Hurwitz intended to do with the forests. But the arithmetic of the takeover was against them. Hurwitz's bid valued the company at a premium to its trading price, and the institutional shareholders, who held the majority of the stock, were legally obligated to consider the offer in the interest of maximizing shareholder value. The takeover was completed. Maxim Inc. now owned the Pacific Lumber Company, and with it, the town of Scotia and approximately 200,000 acres of timberland, containing some of the last privately held old-growth redwood forests on Earth. The consequences were immediate and predictable. The junk bonds that financed the acquisition carried interest rates in the mid-teens. The annual debt service, the amount Maxim had to pay in interest and principal payments every year, ran into tens of millions of dollars. Pacific Lumber's revenue from normal timber operations, managed under the sustained yield policy, was not sufficient to service that debt. The only way to generate enough cash was to cut more trees, faster, from the old-growth groves that had been preserved under the previous management's conservative harvesting plan. Hurwitz tripled the rate of logging. Stands of ancient redwoods that Pacific Lumber had deliberately left unharvested for decades, trees that had been growing since before the European discovery of the Americas, were now marked for cutting. The acceleration of logging triggered one of the most contentious environmental conflicts in American history. Earth First, the radical environmental group founded by Dave Foreman, organized tree sits and road blockades in the forests around Scotia. Activists chained themselves to trees, suspended themselves from platforms built high in the canopy, and lay down in front of logging trucks on the narrow roads that wound through the forest. Julia Butterfly Hill, a young woman from Jonesboro, Arkansas, climbed a 180-foot-tall, 600-year-old redwood in December 1997 and refused to come down. She lived on a small wooden platform near the top of the tree for 738 days, through 2 winters, through storms that sent winds screaming through the canopy, through the cold fog of the Pacific Coast winter. Her tree sit became a national media event. The tree was named Luna. Hill came down on December 18, 1999, after Pacific Lumber agreed to spare Luna and a surrounding buffer zone. The loggers of Scotia and the surrounding communities watched the environmental protests with a mixture of fury and despair. Many of them understood, at some level, that the accelerated logging was not sustainable, and that Hurwitz was sacrificing the forest's future to pay his debts. But the protesters were threatening their livelihoods in the present. A logger in Humboldt County in the 1990s did not have the luxury of long-term ecological reasoning. He had a mortgage or a rent payment to the company and children in school, and the logging was the only work available. The tension between the environmental movement and the logging communities of the North Coast was real and bitter and personal. Bumper stickers appeared on pickup trucks in Scotia and Rio Dell and Fortuna. Are you an environmentalist, or do you work for a living? The activists, many of whom had come from cities and college campuses, were viewed as outsiders who wanted to save trees at the expense of families. The loggers, in the activists' view, were being manipulated by a corporate raider who was using them as disposable labor to strip the forest for profit. Both sides were, in their own way, correct. The Headwaters Forest Agreement of 1999, negotiated between Pacific Lumber, the state of California, and the federal government, represented the most significant attempt to resolve the conflict. Under the agreement, Pacific Lumber transferred approximately 7,500 acres of old-growth redwood forest, including the Headwaters Grove, the largest remaining unprotected old-growth redwood stand in private ownership, to public ownership. In return, the company received $480 million in federal and state funds. The agreement was supposed to end the timber wars. It did not. Environmental groups argued that the deal did not protect enough forest. Logging communities argued that the restrictions imposed on the remaining timberlands would strangle their operations. Both sides filed lawsuits. The Headwaters Agreement bought time, but it did not buy peace. The company's decline accelerated through the late 1990s and into the 2000s. The old-growth timber that had been Pacific Lumber's most valuable asset was being depleted at a rate that could not be sustained, even under the most aggressive harvesting plan. Spotted owl regulations and other environmental protections imposed by the federal and state governments restricted logging on certain lands. Lawsuits filed by environmental groups tied up harvesting permits in court for months and years. The price of redwood lumber fluctuated with the housing market, and the crashes of 2001 and 2008 hit the demand side hard. The debt from the Maxim takeover remained a crushing burden. Pacific Lumber was paying for its own acquisition with its own forests, and the forests were running out. Inside Scotia, the effects of the accelerated logging and the corporate instability were visible in ways both large and small. The workforce shrank as logging operations were curtailed by regulation and litigation. Houses that had been occupied by Pacific Lumber employees for decades stood empty as families moved away to find work in other industries. The cookhouse, where workers had eaten together for generations, served fewer meals. The swimming pool was closed. The baseball diamond, where company teams had played on summer evenings, grew weedy and unused. The company reduced its maintenance of the town's infrastructure. Potholes appeared in the streets. Paint peeled from the houses. The elm trees on the main street were not replaced when they died. The town was still functional, still inhabited, still recognizable as the place it had always been, but it was fraying at the edges in a way that everyone could see and no one could stop. On January 18, 2007, the Pacific Lumber Company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Southern District of Texas. The filing listed assets and liabilities that told the story of the Maxim acquisition in financial terms. The company owed more than it was worth, and the debt was the legacy of the junk bonds that Hurwitz had used to buy it 22 years earlier. The bankruptcy proceedings lasted approximately 18 months. During that time, the future of Scotia, its houses, its mill, its power plant, its streets, was the subject of negotiations among lawyers, creditors, regulators, environmental groups, and potential purchasers. The people who actually lived in Scotia had no seat at the table. Their town was an asset in a bankruptcy estate, to be disposed of in whatever manner maximized the recovery for creditors. The resolution came in July 2008. The bankruptcy court approved a reorganization plan that split Pacific Lumber's assets between two purchasers. The timberlands, approximately 209,000 acres of redwood and Douglas fir forest, were transferred to a new entity called the Humboldt Redwood Company, which was backed by Fisher Investments, the family office of the Gap clothing chain founders. Humboldt Redwood committed to managing the forests under a more conservative, sustainable harvesting plan, a return, in theory, to the kind of stewardship that Pacific Lumber had practiced before the Maxim takeover. The town of Scotia itself, all 270 structures, the mill, the power plant, the streets, the water system, the entire physical infrastructure of the community, was transferred to Marathon Structured Finance, a New York-based investment fund. The name Pacific Lumber disappeared. After 145 years, the company that had built Scotia, that had employed its workers, that had owned every building and every foot of ground, was dissolved. The loggers and mill workers who remained were offered employment by the new entities, but the terms were different, the scale was smaller, and the paternalistic relationship that had defined life in Scotia for more than a century was gone. Workers who had rented their homes from Pacific Lumber for $75 a month now faced the prospect of buying or renting from a financial holding company whose interest in Scotia was strictly commercial. Marathon Structured Finance began selling the houses to their occupants and to outside buyers. The prices were modest by California standards, reflecting the remoteness of the location and the uncertainty of the economic future. But they were substantial for families who had spent their entire lives paying nominal rent. A 3-bedroom house that had rented for $75 a month might sell for $150,000 or more. Some workers bought their homes. Others could not afford to or chose not to and left. The general store closed. The hotel changed hands. The cookhouse, which had served meals to Pacific Lumber employees since the early 20th century, shut its doors. The community hall was still used for occasional events, but the regular dances and dinners and holiday celebrations that had once filled it were largely gone. The mill continued to operate under the new ownership, but at a fraction of its former capacity. The days of cutting massive old-growth redwood logs were over. The remaining timber was second growth, smaller in diameter and less valuable, and the market for it was more competitive. The whine of the headsaw, which had been the dominant sound of Scotia for more than a century, was quieter now, intermittent, no longer the steady pulse of a working town, but the sporadic activity of an operation winding down. The population of Scotia fell with the certainty of water flowing downhill. From approximately 1,200 residents at its peak, the community shrank to 850, then to 681 in the 2020 census. Some estimates placed the 2022 population at 510 or fewer. The people who left were predominantly the younger workers, the ones with school-aged children, the ones who needed steady employment and could not wait for Scotia to reinvent itself. They went to Eureka, 25 miles to the north, or to the Central Valley, or to Oregon, or wherever the job listings pointed. The people who stayed were a mixture of retirees, longtime residents who could not imagine living anywhere else, and a handful of younger families who had found work in the diminished mill or in the scattered small businesses of the Eel River Valley. Charles Hurwitz, the man whose debt finance takeover had set the entire sequence of events in motion, never lived in Scotia. He never visited the mill floor. He never ate in the cookhouse. He managed Pacific Lumber from Houston through intermediaries and quarterly earnings reports. When the company filed for bankruptcy, Hurwitz's personal exposure was limited. Maxim Incorporated's losses were absorbed by the institutional holders of the junk bonds and by the creditors who had extended credit to the operating companies. The workers of Scotia, who had lost their jobs, their community, and the only economic system most of them had ever known, bore the consequences. Hurwitz moved on to other deals. The forests bore the scars for decades. The trees that Julia Butterfly Hill had fought to save were still standing. The ones that had been cut to service Hurwitz's debt were stumps in a logged-over hillside, slowly being overtaken by brush and second-growth fir. The environmental toll of the accelerated logging extended far beyond the loss of individual trees. Old-growth redwood forests are ecosystems of extraordinary complexity. A single ancient redwood supports dozens of species of lichens, mosses, ferns, and orchids on its trunk and branches. The canopy, hundreds of feet above the forest floor, forms a microhabitat where certain species of salamanders and invertebrates are found nowhere else on Earth. The marbled murrelet, a small seabird that nests in the upper branches of old-growth conifers, was listed as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act in 1992, in part because of habitat loss in the redwood belt. When Hurwitz's crews cut into the old-growth stands, they were not just removing trees. They were dismantling biological communities that had taken 1,000 years to assemble. The soil was affected too. Redwood forests build soil slowly through the accumulation of needles, bark, and decomposing wood on the forest floor. The root systems of old-growth trees stabilize the steep slopes of the Coast Range, which are geologically active and prone to landslides. When the trees were removed and the slopes were exposed to winter rains, the erosion was severe. Sediment washed into the tributaries of the Eel River, smothering salmon spawning beds and degrading water quality downstream. The coho salmon, once abundant in the Eel River system, declined to the point where it was listed as a threatened species. The connection between the logging in the forests above Scotia and the decline of the salmon in the river below Scotia was not subtle, and it was not lost on the fishermen and the biologists who documented it. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation pursued a separate case against Hurwitz and Maxim, alleging that Hurwitz had looted the assets of United Savings Association of Texas, a savings and loan institution connected to his business network, costing taxpayers approximately $1.6 billion. The case was settled in 2008. Hurwitz never served time in prison. No criminal charges were filed in connection with the destruction of the old-growth forests or the collapse of the company town. The junk bonds that financed the acquisition were legal instruments. The accelerated logging, while ecologically devastating, was conducted under permits issued by state and federal agencies. The entire sequence of events, from the hostile takeover in 1985 to the bankruptcy in 2007, was legal. This fact was, to the residents of Scotia and to the environmentalists who had spent 2 decades fighting the logging, perhaps the most difficult thing to accept. The law had permitted everything that had happened. The law had not prevented the destruction of either the forest or the town. Humboldt Redwood Company, the entity that had acquired Pacific Lumber's timberlands, implemented a more conservative management plan. The company hired foresters who understood sustainable yield and who were committed to restoring the forest's ecological health over the long term. Logging continued because the forest could sustain a level of harvesting without degradation, but the rate was far below what Hurwitz had demanded. The old-growth groves that had survived the Maxim era were designated as protected areas. Restoration work began on the most severely logged slopes, with crews planting native species and installing erosion control measures. It was slow work, measured in decades, not quarters. The foresters understood that they were not managing a timber inventory. They were nursing a wounded ecosystem back to health. In Scotia itself, the transition from company town to something else, whatever that something else would turn out to be, proceeded with the uneven pace of all involuntary transformations. Marathon Structured Finance sold houses. Some new residents arrived, drawn by the low prices and the beauty of the setting. A few entrepreneurs opened small businesses, a coffee shop, a bed and breakfast, a small brewery that served hikers and kayakers passing through the Eel River Valley. The Scotia Museum, housed in a building that had once been part of Pacific Lumber's operations, preserved the history of the company town with photographs, tools, and artifacts from the mill. Visitors could see the crosscut saws and the peavies and the springboards that the early loggers had used, and they could read the names of the families who had lived in Scotia for 3 and 4 generations. The old mill building, stripped of its machinery and its purpose, stood on the valley floor like a cathedral without a congregation. Its massive wooden beams, cut from the same redwood trees it had been built to process, were still structurally sound after a century. The building was too large and too remote to be easily repurposed. It was not a factory that could be converted into loft apartments or an arts center, as had happened with industrial buildings in Brooklyn and Detroit and Pittsburgh. It was a redwood mill in a valley at the end of a 5-hour drive from anywhere, and its future, like the future of the town around it, was uncertain. The nearby town of Rio Dell, just across the Eel River from Scotia, absorbed some of the displaced workers and became, in a sense, Scotia's overflow. Rio Dell had its own problems. Its downtown had been declining for years. Its schools were underfunded. But it had the advantage of being an incorporated city with its own government, its own tax base, and its own ability to apply for state and federal grants. Some former Pacific lumber families moved across the bridge and bought houses in Rio Dell, where prices were low, and the schools, while struggling, were at least public institutions that did not depend on the continued existence of a single employer. The relationship between Scotia and Rio Dell, which had always been complementary, became more complicated as Scotia's population declined and Rio Dell tried to position itself as the stable alternative. The Eel River Valley's economic future, to the extent that anyone could see it, lay in a combination of small-scale timber operations, cannabis cultivation, which was legalized in California in 2016 and became a significant employer in Humboldt County, tourism related to the Redwood parks, and the slow accumulation of remote workers and retirees who were drawn to the area's natural beauty and low cost of living. None of these activities, individually or collectively, had the capacity to replace Pacific Lumber's role as the valley's economic anchor. But they represented something that Scotia had never had before: economic diversity. A town that had depended on one company for 145 years was, for the first time, not dependent on anyone. This was liberating and terrifying in equal measure. The story of Scotia is not a story about the death of a town exactly. The town still exists, people still live there, the post office still operates, the volunteer fire department still responds to calls, children still ride bicycles on the streets that Pacific Lumber paved 100 years ago. But the thing that made Scotia what it was, the complete integration of a community into a single company's operations, the ownership of every structure and every service by one employer, the web of mutual obligation and dependency that held the place together, that is gone. It was destroyed not by the natural forces of economic change, not by the kind of slow decline that hollowed out the factory towns of the Midwest, but by a single financial transaction. One man, sitting in an office in Houston, decided that the trees were worth more cut down than standing up, and the town that had been built to cut those trees was consumed by the debt he incurred to buy them. There is a particular cruelty in the way Scotia's story differs from the stories of other American company towns. In Gary, Indiana, and in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and in Newton, Iowa, the companies that built those cities were brought down by structural economic forces. Steel became cheaper to make in other countries. Washing machines could be manufactured more efficiently in non-union plants. The industries that had sustained those cities were hollowed out by competition and globalization and the relentless logic of comparative advantage. The decline was painful, but it was impersonal. Nobody decided to destroy those cities. The market did it. Scotia was different. Scotia was destroyed by one man's decision to buy a company he did not understand and strip its assets to pay for the purchase. The market did not demand the destruction of the old-growth redwoods. Hurwitz demanded it. The market did not require the dissolution of the company town. Hurwitz's debt required it. The sustained yield policy that had kept Pacific Lumber and Scotia alive for 120 years was abandoned not because it was economically unsound. It had been sound for over a century, but because it was insufficient to service the debt that one financier had voluntarily incurred. The irony is precise and bitter. The very quality that made Pacific Lumber worth buying, its massive inventory of unharvested old-growth timber, was the quality that Hurwitz destroyed in order to pay for having bought it. The remaining residents of Scotia did not use the word destroyed to describe what had happened to their town. They used words like changed and different and not what it was. An older man who had worked at the mill for 30 years told a reporter from the Los Angeles Times that he did not blame the company. The company, he said, was gone. The thing that called itself Pacific Lumber after 1985 was not the company he had worked for. It was something else wearing the same name. The company he had worked for would never have cut the old trees that way. The company he had worked for understood that the forest and the town and the workers were parts of the same thing, and that you could not destroy one without destroying the others. A woman who had grown up in Scotia and returned after college to raise her children there told a writer from the San Francisco Chronicle that the hardest thing was not the loss of the jobs or the houses or the company. The hardest thing was the loss of the assumption that the place would always be there. She had grown up believing that Scotia was permanent, that the mill and the town and the forest and the river were all parts of a system that had been running for longer than anyone could remember and would continue running for longer than anyone could imagine. That assumption had been the foundation of her childhood and her sense of place and her identity. When it turned out to be wrong, when it turned out that everything she had taken for granted could be sold by a man she had never met to pay for a debt she had never incurred, the loss was not just economic, it was existential. She did not leave Scotia, but the Scotia she stayed in was not the Scotia she had grown up in. It was something else. A town with the same name and the same houses and the same river running through the valley below, but without the thing that had made it what it was. On quiet mornings in Scotia, when the fog rolls in from the coast and fills the Eel River Valley, the town looks almost exactly as it did in 1960 or 1940 or 1920. The small frame houses are still there, painted in their original colors, lined up in neat rows on the terrace above the river. The main street is still shaded by the trees that replaced the original elms. The air smells of redwood and damp earth, and if you stand at the edge of town and look up into the hills, you can see the dark green wall of the forest rising above the ridgeline, the trees that survived everything. The mill is silent. The headsaw does not scream. The logging trucks do not rumble through town at dawn. The cookhouse door is closed. But the river still runs, the fog still comes, and 510 people, give or take, still live in the houses that a timber company built for their grandparents in a valley that most Americans have never heard of, in a forest that most Americans will never see, in a town that once belonged entirely to one company and now belongs, uncertainly and incompletely, to the people who stayed. The redwoods are still growing. They have been growing for 1,000 years. They will be growing long after the last person who remembers the name Pacific Lumber is gone.